If you're chronically online like I am, you've probably seen the raging debate among gaming enthusiasts. Emulation, right or wrong? With the rise of platforms like the Steam Deck and readily available Nintendo Switch emulators, this debate has only been inflamed. While some argue that emulation is a legitimate way to exercise your right as a customer, concerns about software piracy have raised important ethical questions. This video aims to explore in detail the morality of emulation, consider its legality, the issue of software piracy, the response of companies like Nintendo, and of course, what the future may hold for the industry. If you've only ever heard the term emulation as it applies to video games, or if you're only vaguely familiar with the idea in general, allow me to explain. To put it simply, emulation recreates the functionality of one system on another. Often, emulation involves simulating the hardware of one platform in code, thus enabling software designed for another platform to be used on incompatible devices. Emulation itself is not unlawful. Emulators do not typically contain proprietary code from the systems they emulate, and as such, their development and distribution does not infringe upon copyrights of the platform holder. And there is a long legacy of court precedent to back this up, too. But the legality of emulation becomes more complex when considering the use of copyrighted software with emulators. The primary concern surrounding video game emulation is software piracy. And it is absolutely true that game developers invest considerable time and resources into creating and distributing their titles, and piracy really can undermine their ability to generate revenue and sustain their business, as well as the gaming industry at large. Nintendo has an inarguable interest in protecting their intellectual property and preventing unauthorized distribution of their games. However, emulator communities like Yuzu and Ryujinx have taken steps to distance themselves from software piracy, if it's banning the discussion of pirated software on their official forums, or making it more difficult to use pirated games using their emulators. Additionally, their emulators don't contain any proprietary code. These efforts indicate a commitment to responsible emulation that respects the rights of game developers and publishers. However, this hasn't been a two-way street. Despite the legality of emulation itself, companies like Nintendo have taken a regressive stance against emulation, and have vigorously pursued legal action against individuals and websites involved in emulation. And it doesn't even matter if the websites Nintendo has attacked were distributing copyrighted materials or not, despite the fact that not all copyrights should even be considered equal, but we'll get to that in a minute. Presumably, Nintendo's aggressive approach stems from their desire to safeguard their intellectual property and maintain control over their products. However, I would argue that this approach leads to an infringement on consumers' rights. Nintendo's response raises questions about the need for balance between protecting intellectual property and recognizing the natural rights that users have to enjoy the games they legitimately purchased, however they see fit. It also raises concerns about potential limitations imposed on game preservation and accessibility efforts for players who lack access to original hardware or discontinued systems. When examining the ethical implications of video game emulation, it is crucial to weigh the various factors at play. On the one hand, emulation enables us all to preserve and experience games that might otherwise be inaccessible, whether that's due to the unavailability of the game on the market, the required hardware, or other limitations. On the other hand, software piracy can undermine the financial viability of the industry and compromise the livelihoods of developers and publishers. But if we're to believe Nintendo on this topic, all ethical considerations go out the window, and individuals must respect the copyrights in perpetuity to protect the integrity of the video game industry. But purchasing legitimate copies of out-of-print games does nothing for the rights holder. The question is the software piracy concern completely overblown? I believe that it is. As I've already mentioned, Switch emulators do what they can to discourage piracy, but what about emulators for GameCube or the Super Nintendo? Is it even possible to pirate games that you can no longer legitimately buy? There's a vast gray area when it comes to abandonware, software that's out of print, or games that are just no longer commercially available. Where do we draw the line of what's considered piracy? Should we allow the enjoyment of classic video games to be relegated to a privilege for those with the financial means to collect rare or out-of-print games and the hardware to play them? I would argue that no, we shouldn't. According to the Video Game History Foundation, a staggering 87% of classic video games are considered critically endangered. This statistic highlights the urgent need for preservation efforts within the gaming industry. Emulation plays a crucial role in safeguarding gaming history by allowing enthusiasts to access and experience out-of-print software. Emulation fosters a sense of cultural preservation, lending future generations insight into the evolution of the medium. Consequently, I would argue that emulation is an ethical imperative to ensure that gaming history is not lost to time. Should it be considered piracy if a copyrighted work that's only available on the secondary market is downloaded for free? I mean, at worst, this is a victimless crime. If the copyright holder is not making their game available at retail, then they lose nothing in either scenario. And finally, should the only legal option to access retro games be a poorly curated and extremely limited library locked behind a monthly paywall? No, I believe that's highly unethical. The prevalence of such anti-consumer practices within the gaming industry poses a special ethical concern. Monthly subscriptions for access to such libraries undermine not only consumer rights, but also erode the common law understanding of ownership. Such practices prioritize corporate profit over the interests of gamers. It normalizes the role of the consumer not as a customer, but as an object of financial exploitation. And most importantly, it impedes the future preservation and accessibility of gaming content. Ethical considerations demand the outlawing of such anti-consumer practices that limit customer choice and preempt wider access to gaming history. Especially when you consider that most of these games should have already fallen into the public domain by now anyway. And yeah, I told you we'd get here. Current intellectual property laws impede efforts to preserve and access video game content through emulation. Copyrights used to last for 20 years, but now they're virtually immortal. That's why I believe intellectual property law must be reformed to accommodate the public interest. That includes copyrights having a reasonable expiration date. Such reform would allow games and other content to enter the public domain in a timely manner and become accessible for preservation purposes. There also must be a revised legal framework that acknowledges the importance of video game preservation to not only benefit gamers, but also the industry. The ethical implications that arise when considering video game emulation extend far beyond the gaming industry. Emulation itself is not illegal, and in fact, emulation communities have a moral obligation to preserve video game history and stand firm against unethical copyright laws and financial incentives that aim to pervert them further. Companies like Nintendo, driven by their nearsightedness and their nature as a publicly traded company, have taken a strong and misguided stance against emulation. This approach should be blunted by both regulation and reform that represents the public interest to ensure the preservation and accessibility of video games in the future. Striking a balance between copyright protection and the rights of customers is essential to navigate the ethical landscape of video game emulation. Ultimately, we as gamers should be fostering a culture that celebrates the history of gaming through emulation, and we should stand firm against the blind, profit-driven corporate machinations that aim to roll back our rights and censor the history of the industry. We have an obligation to emulate, to preserve the history of video games, and to share the titles that we enjoy today with future generations. I think that's going to do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. I want to thank all the people who support this show on Patreon. It's because of them that I'm able to keep these lights on here, so thank you. If you enjoyed this video, you can become a patron and get your name listed over here, or you can like and subscribe to this channel. That's going to do it for now though. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.